Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. My name is Andreas Wasmuth. I'm the convener for World Affairs, so it's great for you to be here on what is a really poignant topic, the whole issue of the story of the disappeared, political violence, and what's going on in the world in general. But before we come to tonight's main event, I just need to go through a couple of sort of admin side of things for you. For those of you in the room, in the 10 years or so I've been here, the fire alarm has never gone off during an evening lecture. So touch wood, it won't do tonight. If it does, I just need to tell you about the evacuation procedures, and they're very simple. Just form an orderly queue, go down the stairs from which you came up, through the front door which you came in from, turn right, and then right again at the end and assemble at the chapel green. And we will take your names and make sure that everybody is okay. And that really is everything for those of you in the room. For those of you online, just to talk through how you can ask questions. There's three ways of asking questions online. One is by just placing your questions and observations as Brad and Chantal are talking in the chat room, and I'll pick them up and we can cover them at the end of the presentation. The second way is to raise your hand electronically on Zoom, which is something that people do frequently, and I'll pick that up and to make sure that you can ask your questions. And finally, the third way of doing it is to unmute and show your video and ask the question yourself at the end of the presentation. But please don't do so until Brad and Chantal have actually finished. Right, so this is really everything as far as the background admin is concerned. I'm really delighted for Brad and Chantal to be with us today because this is going to be a very special talk. It's combining a very important subject with the personification and representation of that in art form. And, you know, given what is going on in the world at the moment, in every single continent, political violence is a really serious and present danger that we need to communicate about and discuss and come to some conclusions on. And therefore, it's really important to me that Chantal and Brad are here to give us some key insights today. So I'll start ladies first. So Chantal Meza is a self-taught abstract artist who lives in the UK, but originally from Mexico. And she has had various exhibitions and gallery inclusions in Paraguay, in Mexico, and also in the UK. And if you can see from these posters here, there's going to be another exhibition that she's running with Brad that starts on the 28th of October and runs through to the 9th, you say? 8th of November. So in Bristol. So there's plenty of opportunities to sort of discuss this topic more and see all of some 70 pieces of work of art by Chantal. So that's something really looking forward to, and I'm definitely going there with my other half, Sally, at the end of October. And on to Brad. Brad Evans is the professor of political violence at the University of Bath. What a title. The professor of political violence, but he's also the founding chair of the Center for the Study of Violence at the University of Bath, which actually investigates all of this at an international scale. I think before the Bath University, you were at Leeds University, Bristol University, you've been to Columbia University in the States, and I just found out he's also been to Heidelberg University in Germany. So obviously well-traveled man, and he's written or been editing something like 20 books. I think he's been cited or been part of about 150 articles on subjects like political violence. And now both of them are here to talk to us about the story of the disappeared. Please put your hands together for Brad and Chantal.
Thanks for the very kind introduction on this. And I guess without further ado, we will begin the talk, which is called The Story of the Disappeared.
If it doesn't move, you move it. I think it takes, I'm not sure. Is it?
Not sure.
No, actually it blocked it somehow.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, sorry. Sorry about that. So one of the terrifying hallmarks of 20th century totalitarianism was the systematic policy of human disappearance. Whether we think on banishing entire groups of people or one single human being, the ability to exterminate bodies, it's a defining element in the pursuit of total annihilation. What began in concentrated environments, such as the camps of Auschwitz or the gulags of Siberia, soon became a favored and adapted policy brutally enforced by regimes throughout Latin America and elsewhere. During the period of 30 wars, in particularly, despotic regimes from Argentina through Colombia and up to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico orchestrated widespread policies that terrorized through absence, forcing entire communities to live with the perpetual nightmare of disappearance, while family and friends chased unlocatable ghosts, the memory of violence being marked by actions that offer no closure. All the while, the state and its paramilitary forces provisioned their own alibis and denials, which extended the violence, often turning the blame back onto the victims. As we have learned, what these cases show is that when it comes to the psychic life of violence, there is literally more to the spectacle than meets the eye. The symbolic can be just as devastating when something is lacking or violently severed, such as that only the memories of the vanished remain. So living with disappearance can therefore prove to be truly unbearable, for the violence that it passes on to others after the initial act of abduction offers no kind of resolution and no prospect for recovery, assaulting the very order of time itself. So how can we possibly escape from such a nightmare when love is turned into a violent hunting?
The strategy of disappearance is so shocking and difficult to comprehend because the violence is often rationalized, professionalized, and calculated. It is never random, even if its targets appear to have been arbitrarily selected. Its currency is emotional fear that infects the population like a virus, creating constant suspicion and betrayal. Now, we can situate our understanding on the disappeared back to the 1970s Argentina. Indeed, it was following the campaigns of the mothers of the disappeared that the term properly enters the political lexicon. Yet, as many Argentine authors noted, there were eerie similarities, not least the targeting of Jewish activists in Buenos Aires, with the disappearances in Nazi practices during World War II, when many were secretly transferred in Germany under the decree Nacht und Nebel, Night and Fog, that became the focus for Alan Resnais' devastating film. We do have to wonder how much of the Argentine practice was learned from the Nazis who fled to the southern cone of the Americas. We also know that this practice was commonly used by Stalin's totalitarian regime in the Soviet Union and continues in countries such as Russia and Georgia today. It's also worth considering here the Vietnam War. Not only did both the Americans and the Vietnamese engage in acts of abduction and disappearance, we might argue that the military desire to repatriate the bodies of those missing in action was an important moment as it made the trauma of absent bodies a social and political concern. When mapping out the history of disappearance, while focus again often turns to totalitarian regimes, we should not overlook the egregious role played by the US military in normalizing this practice. While the modern era of state-led policies of disappearance developed through the countries of Southern and Central America, the techniques were honed at the School of the Americas, now renamed the Western Hemispheric Institute for Security Cooperation, a US Defense Department training facility at Fort Benning in Columbus in Georgia. For 21 years, South American countries were subjected to a covert campaign of political repression and state terrorism, coordinated by the CIA and characterized by frequent coups, assassinations, and systematic disappearances. During the darker chapters of this, what was called Operation Condor, policies of violence against the US's ideological left-wing enemies spread throughout the continent's southern cone like wildfire. Military generals and officers from Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and later Brazil all trained at the infamous US facility, learning the most effective strategies to destroy opposition and govern their people by instilling a culture of fear. Some estimates put the number of enforced disappearances directly linked to this operation at around 80,000, including a staggering 30,000 bodies taken from the streets of Argentina. While these included known activists and prominent spokespersons demanding social justice and reform, others who only had a very tentative opposition to the military junta and its neoliberal aspirations were among the victims. Now, as mentioned, the term disappeared and disappearance first entered the political vocabulary during Argentina's dictatorship in the mid-1970s, when the state, backed by the US in its so-called dirty war, kidnapped and killed those it perceived to be a threat to its operations, literally disappearing their bodies. Now, beyond the official remit of Condor, the same ideologically driven violence extended throughout the Americas, leaving no country untouched. In Colombia, the government victims unit has registered more than 45,000 victims of disappearance dating back to the 1970s, although another government database more accurately puts the number of the missing around 110,000. While, as in Argentina, many of the victims of the disappeared by the Colombian state and associated right-wing paramilitary organizations was a problem, this was also compounded by the similar tactic by leftist guerrillas organizations and indeed the narco-trafficking cartels. Operation Condor was thus at the heart of a wider security project through which the violence of disappearance became a normalized practice. While not an official part of the program of Operation Condor, more Colombian military officials who have since been indicted as being part of the policy of disappearance trained at the US School of the Americas than any other nation. In many cases, the disappeared would vanish without any witnesses to their abduction. People were swiftly taken from the streets and thrown into cars. In Argentina, Ford Falcons became a symbol of terror, or often they were stolen from their beds in the solitude of the night. Now, often this would be followed by blanket denials, even that a person had actually disappeared by those in power. But as events in Colombia and more recently Mexico have shown, there is sometimes a need to return a mutilated body to remind people of the likely horror. In the infamous case of the 43 student teachers who went missing in the Mexican state of Guerrero in 2017, the brutally tortured body of another student teacher, Julio Cesar Mondragon Fuentes, was discovered the next day. The whereabouts of his fellow students are still unknown.
In Mexico, 110,985 people were reported missing from 1964 to August 2023. Although, according to some civil society organizations, such as the Movement for Our Disappeared in Mexico, only 2 out of 10 cases are reported. Like most Mexicans who grew up during a period marked by the drug wars and the inexorable growth in power, influence, and violence of the narco-trafficking cartels, expressions such as enforced disappearances ended up becoming part of our language. I remember growing up with images of people's faces on street posts, on television, and in newspapers. And these people were called extraviado. This is a term which can be translated into English as gone astray. What this word does is place the blame onto the person themselves, since it suggests the person is that of disordered habits, or that they simply choose to leave the way of life they had and started another one. This way of describing absent bodies invariably was part of the problem from the very beginning. If the person is lost or missing, it is due to their own responsibility. They are in solitude because of their own choices. Therefore, to have a definition of the crime that does justice to the problem is crucial, for it can show us what criteria must be satisfied and what antecedents must be proven to consider that an enforced disappearance has occurred. According to the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, an enforced disappearance is understood to be the arrest, detention, kidnapping, or any other form of deprivation of liberty that is the work of agents of the state or by persons or groups of people acting with the authorization, support, or acquaintance of the state, followed by the refusal to recognize the deprivation of liberty or the concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person, removing it from the protection of the law. But I also recognize there are some more very difficult and complex overlaps that need to be navigated here. The more I have studied and looked into the problem of disappearance, the more I have realized it is not simply a problem that belongs to a place that exists over there. By over there, I mean, of course, I'm referring to my country, the very far land of Mexico. A few years ago, I took Brad to a small town in Veracruz called Antigua. In this town, it was said that the conquistador Hernán Cortés lived and executed much of his orders, including the destruction and disappearance of indigenous peoples and their culture. What's remarkable about Cortés' home today is how it's been recolonized by nature. Indeed, it's been recolonized by trees that were sacred to Mexican indigenous. We thought that was something quite beautiful. There was something quite beautiful about this. But the legacy of Cortés is important to our story here. The story of the disappeared, ever since the conquistadors arrived in April 1520, Mexico has been bound up into a global political economy. What happens in my country, the winds that change its fortunes, have it tend to originate elsewhere. I have recently been in conversations with Dave Grimstead, who is the director of Locate International. It's a UK charity dedicated to helping families of unsolved missing person cases to find their loved ones, and who they are also partner of our project, State of Disappearance. And I was struck by the way so many of the 11,000 record missing in the UK, in the United Kingdom, a figure not too many know about, are in one way or another touched by narcotics. Of course, the story of the missing in the UK and the story of the disappeared in Mexico are different, but there are traces that also bring them together somehow. I do wonder how many young people on a Saturday night here in this country who have a nosebleed as a result of sniffing cocaine really know how those bloodlines circulate. Do they know that white dust is also linked to the disappearances of so many in my country? And that one person's high is another's devastation. I only wish, as an artist, we might be able to convey such an image of the world so we can see the topography of terror that continues to circulate around the planet.
Beyond the spectacle of violence, there is a deeper reason why disappearance is so effective as a political and a psychological strategy. Psychologically, it plays into the most primal of human fears, to vanish without a trace. It induces what the brilliant and late academic Jean Franco called a triple deprivation: a deprivation of body, a deprivation of mourning, and a deprivation of burial. In the act of disappearing life, not only is there a denial of justice that requires the reappearance of victims' bodies for a crime to be proven, there is also the denial of a political process that demands negotiation with the past tragedies so that the future can be steered in a better direction. This is what makes disappearance a true crime against humanity. It is a form of violence that makes it hard to restore something of the human condition. Not only does it deny a person the most basic right to belong to the world, It creates an economy of terror that lives on in the minds of relatives and friends, what we might see as a form of future violence. Since the early 1990s, in zones of conflict and crisis, the lines between state and non-state actors, along with the regulated versus illicit economies, have become almost impossible to separate. Organizations such as FARC in Colombia illustrate the difficulties of distinguishing between ideological groups and mere criminal organizations. In Mexico, Los Zetas, acknowledged to be the most violent of all the world's drug cartels, reveal an even more fraught state-sponsored past. Now, this group's origins, the Los Zetas, can be dated back to the early 1990s, when a group of commandos from the Cuerpo de Fuerzas Especiales, the Mexican Special Forces, broke away from the state and used their knowledge and training to devastating effect. They were originally set up to provide a rapid security response during the 1986 World Cup that was held in the country. But this special forces would soon be attacking the Zapatistas, the indigenous movement in the southern state of Chiapas, which itself had become committed to non-violence. Los Zetas' deployment into the remote jungle regions quickly resulted in the horrifying slaughter of 30 captured indigenous rebels who were found by the side of the river with their ears and noses cut off. Later, the same unit, a number of whom were again trained at the US School of the Americas in psychological warfare, became the key drug cartel in Mexico, triggering a notable acceleration in disappearances. What made Los Zetas especially notorious, beside the fact they had information on all the other cartels, as information given to them by the United States of America, was the brutality and the scale of their violence, including attempted mass killings such as grenade attacks on Independence Day in Morelia in 2008, which injured more than 100 people. Another favorite tactic was to hang bodies from bridges and leave beheaded and dismembered bodies in discoverable locations. That members of Los Zetas, like other previous graduates from the School of the Americas, were trained in psychological warfare is not incidental. It's not enough to simply eliminate opposition. Fear works by having persons change their behavior before they have even considered acting in a particular way. The threat of more violence stops agency and freedom dead in their tracks. While the recent number of enforced disappearances have already been counted as exceeding 100,000 in Mexico, over the same period, more than 4,000 unmarked graves have been discovered in the country, far more than Iraq and Syria, for instance. A significant number of these victims are young women and people from other vulnerable groups, including children and migrants. But the disappearance of nearly 150 journalists highlights the policy of silencing that also goes with it. Today, Mexico is one of the most dangerous places in the world to try to report the truth. Journalists such as Lydia Cacho and Annabel Hernandez continue to risk their lives to expose the corruption that plays in the organization of disappearances. To give you a sense of the scale of the problem, in February 2023, Mexico's Secretary of Public Security, Genaro Garcia Luna, one of the highest ranking law officers in the country in the fight against the drug cartels, was convicted for being on the payroll of the Sinaloa cartel.
I am going to make a U-turn on the subject. Just to put a question, and why is an artist standing here right now giving a lecture on the history of enforced disappearances? And I asked myself a similar question almost 7 years ago. In 2017, my work was turning against me, or at least that's what I felt back then. There were not enough answers to why art was going to help me, and consequently, help others to resolve this gigantic political problem. And I now think that this confusion, born out of deep concerns regarding the direction of my life, rather than a direct conflict with art. In a way, art was just waiting for me, sat in silence, possibly just storing piles of colors and shapes. And I must openly share with you that I'm still trying to figure out myself why art can't change what we seek to transform. It can only transform and change itself. This might be because it exists in other realms, in other worlds and languages. So art is useless when it comes to type on a piece of paper rules and laws and punishments. It just can't do it. No art can. Not a piece of music, not a beautiful dance, not a magnificent piece of literature, or a breathtaking painting. Why a piece of art can't be used to persuade? I'm imagining it could be because it presents you with every voice possible. It situates you on every possible perspective, and it confronts you with your own reflections and places you in every one of its characters, of its shapes and sounds. So persuasion is not even possible. Persuasion, I think, is for benders of illusions or ideas. There were various events in my life that diverted me a couple of years from my canvases, and I was starting to become something more like an activist painter. Although more an activist than a painter, since I couldn't paint much due to my use of time in other matters. Long story short, art won my heart back. I do see a difference between activism and art, especially since I met real truth activists along the way. Activists, to me, are those who risk their lives for a cause, those that have no option sometimes but to become one, those who choose to do it for their strong and irrefutable beliefs regarding a subject, and their persistent characteristic to defend their ideals and their communities as well. So I can say with confidence that I am clearly not one of those. And I tried to mix those and tried to mix those two worlds. For me, it's definitely not a possibility. And I already have explained a bit earlier some of the reasons why I think this is the case.
So fully appreciative then of the need for a questioning voice that brought together the political with the artistic in a less dogmatic way. We wanted with our project to rethink how disappearance can quite easily be seen as a problem at the extreme ends of human denial. It's tempting and perhaps even reassuring to see it this way, as doing so kind of upholds the principle of sovereignty and deludes us into believing that disappearance is somehow an aberration or only happens in regimes which are not liberal democracies. Of course, the limits to intelligibility remain important, but not all limits are external. And I think this is increasingly the case in a world that no longer recognizes any outside and is merely seemingly policing and violently policing internal divisions. What also troubled us was the fact that the exponential rise in disappearances in Mexico coincided with the country's democratization, institutionally understood in the most familiar and yet reductive sense. Hence, without contradiction, we also recognize that disappearance doesn't often live and breathe in some extra legal or extra juridical space, lurking beyond the margins as if it exists in some exceptional vacuum. The stories of the disappeared from Latin America and many other places show to us how disappearance can be extremely normal, terrifyingly normal. Its absences can be terrifyingly apparent and the unknowability defining. So although we agree that there is no greater terror than to be forcibly vanished without a trace, we were still confronting many questions that demanded more sustained reflection. Not least, what do we actually mean by the term disappearance? And how does it expose the limits of our political and aesthetic understanding? Now, we all know that individual peoples and entire groups can be forcibly removed from the planet. And we also know, to cite Helen Fine, the Holocaust scholar, that sometimes lives are so absent from any universe of obligation, they are denied any right to a dignified existence. But do we need to even rethink ourselves the terms of engagement here? How, for instance, might we better respond to such a terrifying state of denial, the absence of presence, in an effort not just to overcome the manipulation of truth and the denial of justice, but to raise serious questions about the hidden order of violence and the effective normalization that makes disappearance possible in the first place.
So what I have learned from Mexico is how the question, sorry, it's not changing. What I have learned from Mexico is how the question of disappearance is not primitive or unruly. On the contrary, it takes a monstrous organizational effort. It does seem an impossible task at times, and yet so many families, human rights collectives, journalists, activists, and civic society have been made the weight of it to tremble. As I was saying earlier, the political problem of enforced disappearances placed me on a poignant moment for my understanding of art and politics. First of all, through a series of conversations I started with Brad at the beginning of 2016, I realized that to be political was not an option. You are born in a civic society with a more or less set of structures. Therefore, your life is part of the others from the very beginning. So you are always taking part on its shapes, whether you intend to or not. So when I finally was able to sense this crisis of mine was started to untangle a little, the shapes were already on the tip of my fingers, ready to scratch and fight with the surface, to dance and bleed, to burst out the lines and rip out the pain. I started the State of Disappearance series with the apparitions drawings. Somehow, through the thin lines I was doing on paper, I began to see the mist of my memories appearing before my eyes in the physicality of its forms. It was easy to take ink and paper due to the immediacy of fleeting images. I was immediately pouring out what seemed to be ghost memories, or perhaps the cloudy patched remembrances of faces. That is how time passed on this white sheet in front of me, with lines that continued to draw vomited, tangle, and cut bodies. The days advanced and there seemed to be no end. In the lines of myself there were now stories not only of the disappeared, but of their families. I saw a mother, a father, siblings, and friends. I could tell then a resemblance of their tormented voices was being left behind on the empty space of the white paper. That was how 1, 2, 10, 20, and 32 drawings were issued. They continued trapped abstractions, beings, and memories that didn't know how to cease. A line is always the simple act of beginning, where the path is reimagined. The movement grows and the shadows appear as clouds, guided by the wind and caressed by the light. They hold a dense weight and never halt. They dissolve with the solitary line, the one that extends through the blank space where a hand will tangle and unravel at the tip of the graphite. In that line, there are more precise indications of our pulse than those of a heart rate monitor. Its feeling is absolute with the rest of the body. A machine has never been able to know the feeling of a pulse. That is only a matter of human nature. The line breathes alongside the chest, a breathing that goes and doesn't stop over time until it does. And something else happens, the exchange of a line in the hand for the subconscious of our lives. In there will be pauses that will sought in their silences by revealing themselves through the tip of the pencil onto the paper, a subtle but precise movement that depletes into a flow of transparencies and illusions. There is no end, just an exhausted being. Shadows undressed, receiving flashes of light. And then spaces are open, points are being discovered, together or alone, whatever it may be. They stand out strongly in their whiteness of space, because the tip of the graphite has been stripped bare.
What Chantal's work forced me to confront as a political theorist is what we might properly call the aesthesis of violence, namely the violence that lives in the realm of the imagination, but is no less real, something which is defining of disappearance. Throughout history, state-sponsored disappearance has proved extremely effective in quietening resistance and governing through such fears. But as Chantal has already noted, what we also know is the organization of disappearance takes a great deal of political and financial investment, requiring considerable organization and planning. It takes significant effort to prevent bodies from ever being found, especially in a digital age when details of such crimes can be more easily shared. However, digital technology also presents a significant challenge for families searching for their loved ones and those trying to deal with the legacies of disappearance. While groups working on behalf of the disappeared use the internet and social media to disseminate information and maintain visibility, our interviews have revealed a strong suspicion of communication devices with the families and the growing surveillance state. The digital revolution has given more power to those who master the technology. Disappearance has taken new forms, enabled by tracking systems, such as drones that can subsequently be erased. Despite these dangers, we've monitored many courageous attempts by communities who continue to demand answers to what happened to the disappeared. In Mexico alone, there are some 130 search collectives tasked with trying to recover the remains of the missing. As one family member has explained, the whole country is a clandestine grave. Aside from the fact that those searching for the disappeared often end up being violently threatened and even disappearing themselves, the psychological impact demands a more expansive appreciation of the suffering they endure. Our research has repeatedly found that living with disappearance can be truly unbearable, because the violence truly does offer no sense of recovery. Now, psychological studies of families dealing with missing persons have spoken of a vortex of grief. Dealing with what the International Red Cross identifies as ambiguous loss demands new therapeutic responses that appreciate the lasting effects of this absence. Close relatives are often deeply traumatized and haunted by what has been termed intrusive memories. Studies of those living in the aftermath of the Holocaust have shown how trauma can also be transmitted across generations. Yet, despite all this evidence, not enough attention is paid to the lasting psychological and social impacts of communities living with disappearance. Part of the problem, of course, is that many of these communities are desperately poor and already disenfranchised. In life, they're often forgotten. So is it any wonder that in death they are denied?
As an artist, I'm consumed with that denial. Is the form emptiness? Recent ideas I have developed sought to understand the physicality of our own materiality, and beyond this, our disappearance, hence appearance into the abstract. It is difficult to pinpoint the beginning of my creations, but I could speak of three core roots: abstraction, the form, and the subject. By moving between the mundane and the verbally inexplicable in life, we get closer to exploring the abstract meaning of art. I maintain that the human body is more than the human body, but without its presence, there is no creative abstraction. A vortex of questions do emerge when I'm painting or dwelling in the silence. For the Obscure Beasts series, which have been shown on the slices, some of the questions that haunted me were as follows. Who are we pursuing? Which one is the perpetrator? Where are the bodies? Who is to blame for my eternal regret? Who deserves such atrocities? And where should we drift the blood? Where should the drift of blood go to? Already in here, pictures began to emerge. a thick matter appears, a dense color emerges until it becomes a deep black, as deep as the darkness of a cold and endless tunnel. Yet there is rage, and how not to be enraged when impunity increases. There is no escape because everything in here is war. You see no way out, and only the confronter remains. The risk of being annihilated, yourself and the ones around you. And that is how the pigments on the paper will start to become masses of stained earth, one on top of another and another. The ashes begin to fall and fury grows, turning it into a dissolved body, a body who just like mud drowns itself. These painted forms are filled with terror because they have been trapped in a rumble battle that doesn't reveal much more than the remains of our bewildered, lapidated, and defiled body, lifted away in a savage gust. But look at us now. Why is that painting has become wild? Why has it been said a savage begins with the animal? What happens after we realize that what we are seeing and feeling no longer seems to be the same? What the British Mexican painter, Leonora Carrington, did brilliantly in her book Down Below was to describe these juxtapositions. The real, the impossible, the animal, the human, the magic, the conflicts and the confusions of it all. When she says, I realized that my anguish, my mind, if you prefer, was painfully trying to unite itself with my body. My mind could no longer manifest itself without producing an immediate effect on my body, on matter. Later, it would exercise itself upon other objects. I was trying to understand this vertigo of mine, that my body no longer obeyed the formulas established in my mind, the formulas of old limited reason, that my will no longer meshed with the faculties of movement. And since my will no longer possessed any power, it was necessary first to liquidate my paralyzing anguish, then to seek an accord between the mountain, my mind, and my body, in order to be able to move around in this new world. Perhaps by no longer wanting to feel any sensation in our bodies, running away is inevitable. The escape from our skin to madness, to the idea of knowing something else, something other than our body, but it's something that would allow us to release what we are incapable of understanding. I believe the animal appears at this moment. It is precisely here when us humans, we transform with our own means to the abstract of what could seem an impossible sensation. We are attracted to the idea of falling beyond the frustrations of our stagnant pace. We ask ourselves, is this really what all my body is? Is this only what I'm made of? Vulnerable flesh and bone, a wretched soul? This might be how we allow ourselves to imagine those false physical possibilities. We know our skin could never turn into delicate plumage, but nevertheless, we play with the idea of it. We know that strong, sharp, and curved clouds will never grow from our hands, and yet we sometimes feel like tearing things apart with them. We might possess or enhance. We might use or domain. We could destroy or tame. But all these just to reveal how our bodies admixtures find no impediments to see themselves like those creatures. Art seems to breed from these ideas. It lets madness flow, allowing the brush to move in billowing movements, and the body to be reframed and go crazy in the coming and going of our imagination. We escape our bodies only in the abstract. One thing I'm always turned by is when people ask, how can my art look so beautiful when it deals with such violence?
In June 2023, Argentina repatriated a plane from the US that had been used in the campaign of death flights in which victims were thrown from the air while still unconscious. For those who don't know, the plane was actually being used just to send people as part of a tourism exercise in the United States of America. The extent of this strategy was only properly understood when the body started washing up on the shores of the Rio del Plata in December 1977 as a result of a freak weather pattern. Now, the repatriated plane will soon go on display at the former Navy and Mechanics School in Buenos Aires, now the EMSA Museum and Site of Memory, a clandestine detention facility in which many of the disappeared were held before their disposal. The re-emergence of such items, which also includes a fleet of Ford Falcons used by the death squads, highlights the importance of material objects that give us at least some visible form to the violence of absence. In the same way, it is understandable why we see so many of the families and campaigners of the disappeared harnessing the power of art to represent their loss. There can be no peace at a micro level if individuals and communities remain traumatized by wounds that cannot heal because of a gaping absence. This seems to be still one of the sticking points in the island conflict around the disappeared. Josefina Echeverria Alvarez, director of the Peace Accords Matrix at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, offered this perspective in relation to the extensive work she was doing as part of the Columbia Truth Commission. What I have seen in my work as a peace educator over decades in various post-war contexts has been the importance of art-based responses. Art-based practices are central, not peripheral, to peace building, to rebuilding relationships after war, changing the dynamics of human interaction, especially with those who have been historically separated from us. Art reveals better than anything else the spirit of freedom. It's no coincidence that the Nazis put the so-called degenerate artists on trial, nor that the Pinochet regime disappeared the musician Victor Jara, whose tortured and bullet-ridden body was discovered days after his abduction. Jara's creative sensibility marked him as a prime enemy of the Chilean state. There's nothing an authoritarian personality despises more than free expression and creation, for it is the essence of resistance. I might cite the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, who argued to create is to resist. Moreover, through art, difficult conversations become possible. A door is opened that may allow something of the human to be recovered. A notable example here is the Chilean film director Patricio Guzman's documentary Nostalgia for the Light, and if any of you haven't seen it, I'd strongly recommend you take a look, which focuses our attention on the barren emptiness of the Atacama Plains and the women of Calama in Chile. What begins as an astronomical mediation on the telescoping search of distant galaxies and stars slowly turns its lens to the uninhabitable desert and the appearance of distant figures, the women still searching amongst the dust for the remains of their husbands and loved ones. Decades of searching mean they can easily tell the difference between white stones and human fragments. Theirs is a story of defiance in a place where the rains have refused to fall for more than a millennium, but is also a story revealing the chasm of power that reaches across time. I just wish telescopes didn't look at the sky, but could look through the earth and be able to locate the bodies, one of the women laments, as she goes through the impossible motions of another day. Now, the first stage of our State of Disappearance project, as mentioned at the beginning, culminates with an exhibition of Chantal's art in Bristol from October the 28th to November the 8th. Our project began as a result of the artistic demand to respond to the horrors of enforced disappearance in Chantal's country, and has since instigated a series of international collaborations, bringing together many respected academics, dancers, musicians, advocacy groups. The challenge we all confronted was largely the same. What can art, politics, and society do when the human body is so denied? Now, the project doesn't claim to resolve this, nor has it sought to impose any kind of political doctrine. But it does, at least as again mentioned in the important introduction, try to open up new conversations on what disappearance means, the form it takes, and how we might better imagine a response. I think one of the crises we seem to face today is a crisis of the political imagination. Disappearance constitutes a form of violence that rips open a wound in time. It weaponizes the visual as the terror it induces becomes prey to what is no longer seen. Part of the demand for justice, then, has to concern memory. This means to humbly consider the role of visual testimony, which the arts can certainly help with.
So as artists, we can only venture to wonder the meaning of disappearance, whether in brushstrokes, dancing movements, musical compositions, or the written word. But our lost worlds and the limits of our straight answers can be fiercely poured into those creations. Maybe through our encounters with artists and other collaborations, we find it easier to appear and disappear, to be never found, but just to leave a trace. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed to Chantal and Brad. What a fascinating account. It just shows how art and words reach different parts of us. Very interesting. You know, they speak to different aspects of us, our personality, our humanity. And thank you very much. And I'm plugging the exhibition coming up on the 28th of October to the 8th of November. If you want to have a look in the actual pieces of art and talks, sounds fascinating. We'll start off with questions in the room before we go on to any questions online. So, anybody in the room has a question? Gentleman at the front. If you could speak directly into.
Phil Corbishley. I'm an amateur to all of this. In terms of, I've got two questions actually. One of the images that you've created in your art. This is to Chantal. They remind me very much of pictures that my wife writes or does, purely from some soul healing that she does. Her parents were refugees, or grandparents were refugees from Turkey under the pogroms in the 1920s, 1923. And she, as part of, so she sees it's a family system, behavior that's run down from her grandparents to her parents, the 13 fears they continuously have. You know, it's a bit, they make the joke in the film, the Greek family wedding, the Greek wedding about Yahya is always frightened when he hears an airplane because she thinks the Turks are coming. Well, my grandfather, or my wife's grandfather, was actually murdered and disappeared in Turkey as one of those pogroms. He was a priest. He just disappeared. And that pictures you've done are very similar to these soul expressions that she has been doing. I'm not sure it's a question or really whether it's a statement, but there is something very deep that gets buried in a family system that can only be expressed in colors and shapes. And just the question really is that something that you've had from your experience? Is that how you've got to where you've got to through your family system having been tormented for many generations? Is that where it's come from? And my second question really is a more of a literature one. I mean, in 1984 by George Orwell, they probably solved this problem by saying, you know, we recognize that under the Nazi system, we produced all of these martyrs who could then overrule the system. And the only solution is actually to convert people back to the system so they don't notice what's gone on. And the Ministry of Truth, of course, rewrites history to ensure that this happens. And then when they've actually cured, when O'Brien actually cures Winston Smith, they put him back into society in the Chestnut Cafe. I don't even remember the story. To sort of negate all the points that you were making about negativity about the disappearance. So that in the end, they don't disappear. Well, they do disappear, but they come back. And that's my two questions. So, I mean, I'll like to discuss it between you now.
Yeah. it is strange. I don't know whether it's because I am I'm a painter, I would say, since I remember, I've been always drawing and stuff. So in a way, for me, painting or drawing is just more like just like being, it's not I don't seem to, and especially with this thing, what I was trying to express was that I was not trying to portray something. I think I was not thinking, right, I saw this, therefore I'm going to do this. It's more that I just had paper. I'm always surrounded by those materials. So it's more about, I just need to do something because I can't express it. I can't talk about it, especially because it's such a political, difficult problem to discuss. It's not something you normally just go out discussing with people. It's difficult. So I think, if anything, is something working on silences sometimes, as a society, you learn how to be silent. And so I think there are loads of things you can't say. And so for me, I think through art, I never felt healed. On the contrary, I think it was more like an exhaustion. So it was just pouring things there that they just needed to go there, because otherwise you feel like exploding. You feel like just you don't function. So to me, I'm not sure, and I've never seek into my paintings. I don't see them as as healing. Actually, I feel them on the contrary, because it's quite torturous. So it's quite torturous to go deep inside to try to just expel it. So it's basically a place where you go on silence to, well, just to be, because you can't be with somebody else. Sometimes it's difficult. So in that sense, I don't know whether it works as I just don't see it as a therapy, because actually it's quite not traumatic, because it's not traumatic, but it's quite difficult. But I have to do it because I don't function otherwise, Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if to call it like a therapy. I mean, I just don't come out of it and say, oh yeah, cool, I'm healed. And next to the move, I move, I don't feel like I move. On the contrary, I mean, I have done works and probably I had just to stop. But 75-hour works is not just like, it's just quite a bit too much, I think. So, but I think I had to stop. And I don't know. I don't. It's just that maybe I feel like maybe this is my wrong way of seeing it. But I think with therapy, you are meant to be better. You're meant to go to therapy to be better. And I don't feel like, first of all, I understand the problem at itself. As I can say, it's just endless and actually is consuming. So I'm not sure. Maybe we will disagree on that. I haven't found it yet.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think there's 2 points in terms of, I'm mindful to open up to other questions, but I think the point around the deeper, right? And I think commenting on this as the witness to art. So as a witness to, we're all, one of the things that defines our age, I think, is we're all forced witness to events which seem all beyond our control. And the question for this, how do we respond to them? What kind of politics is needed for the world right now? And we were having this conversation at the beginning that what felt like 15 years ago of the promise of social media has become disastrous. And actually, I think perhaps one of the things we need more urgently in the world today is the space for more deeper reflection on the state of the world and the kind of world we want to create. And I think that is the space where art becomes important, because works like Chantal's, demand a deeper, sustained reflection. You're not going to get an immediate answer. You need that kind of engagement. No, just a brief point about Orwell. I think often, I actually go back to Orwell quite recently and read through it again and watch the films with Richard Burton and so on. And people miss the trick with Orwell's 84 if they reduce it to technology. It's a book which is far more than technology. It's actually a book about torture and the destruction of the human while they're still alive, and the breaking down of the human while they're still alive. It's a book about visible spectacles of terror. But there's a lot that's hidden there as well. And the disappearances, you know, are often the most violent disappearances are the ones that are hidden in plain sight from us, ones that we just walk past, you know, and that's an even greater terror sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question. Exactly that. So disappeared in plain sight is probably the pertinent answer to the second question that you posed. I think just to the first question, I suppose, does art reach into something that can't be expressed in words? Something that actually you can document within yourself that you wouldn't be able to really put into a syntax?
Yeah, possibly. I think, you know, I can't speak obviously about all art and every artist, but I just can talk through what that to me it is, and it's okay to have various languages, because I think we just, of course, that we work with words and we express ourselves, we communicate, right, with words, and we try the best we can to express with words what we mean. But it's okay to accept that there are other languages which don't need us to speak. And that's okay. You know, nobody asks to, well, no, nobody, but not often we find asking ourselves to musicians, hey, just explain me this note and what this note and other notes linked to this note means. But we seem to ask a lot of questions sometimes with, you know, with painters. The painters, we ask them, oh, well, specifically what this brushstroke you did here and what this, you know, means. So I think it's okay just to say that painting, you know, the visual is just is the visual. And it is okay to say as well that all of us will get different things from that thing we are listening to, reading to, or looking at. And I think that's and that we sometimes we will want to express, you know, with words things, but it's okay that if it doesn't come out that way, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. By the way, online you can unmute and you can show your video if you want to and ask a question directly of Brad and Chantal. But in the meantime, we'll go back to the room. Any more questions in the room? Lady there, if you could speak directly.
Hi, given that your art is in reaction to political violence, how's it received, or have you exhibited in Mexico, and how does that go down?
Yeah, well, this is the first, the State of Disappearance series is the first, is the first series I engage, or the first work that I engage with a political problem. And it was difficult because previous to that, as I said at the beginning, it was about 2016, 17, when I started to just, I suppose, encountering these problems and thinking politically, I care for this, I open my eyes, I see this is happening. Do I have to do something with my work? I felt like I was not obliged, but pretty much obliged to just do something about it. So I think in Mexico is difficult, of course, because the subject itself is difficult. So since I started this series of works, has been, I haven't found the place yet. And since I moved to the UK, then it was also that side of things. So I think I've been finding better places to expose it in other countries, such as the UK. And obviously Mexico is difficult because of obvious reasons, and the problem is still beating. I don't know if that's expression in the UK, but the problem is still beating. So it's difficult to have this work exhibited, and yeah, it's just difficult. Yeah.
Okay, just a reminder to the online audience, you can also put your questions in the chat room, nothing yet, and unmute yourself and show the video if you want to ask questions directly. So, anybody else in the room before online gets going? Yeah, gentleman over there. No, because the online audience won't be able to hear you.
You mentioned this, I think it was Brad, with artwork in Nazi Germany being taken. Is the State of Disappearance amplified by the destruction of cultural works by these people that are targeted. Does that make sense? I might be.
Well, I guess the question that always kind of, preoccupies me is, why is it, for instance, that totalitarian regimes, or most regimes, often reveal their inherent violence once they clamp down on artists, right? So often, actually, the first signs of the shift in the dynamic of a totalitarian regime is not the rounding up of political activists, but the rounding up of artists, actually. Right? And you see this historically, it's a continuous pattern. Now, the case of Nazi Germany is a very poignant example in terms of, it's a poignant example to me, the absolute litmus test why we should always have complete freedom for art. Right? And I think the reaction of the Nazi regime, of course, you have to bear in mind, of course, it wasn't the destruction of all art, because when you had the Degenerate Art exhibition, which featured notably many Jewish artists, but of course was a fundamental critique on abstract expressionism, that kind of search for a deeper meaning to the human subject. The putting on trial of that was also alongside the Great German Art Show, right? So this remarkable display of figurative art about what the ideal human was meant to look like in this kind of Aryan kind of figuration. So it's not like the destruction of all art, it's the promotion of a particular kind of art. And I think, and again, that might bring us back to 1984, right? It's about, often, sometimes the greatest violence is carried out in the name of progress, the name of asserting emancipatory vision, which will literally destroy and disappear other forms of life. And you see that then in the context of Mexico, the great progress that happens in Mexico at the start of the 20th century was predicated on the destruction of indigenous ways of living and the disappearance of those modes of living. So I think that kind of, you can have, they're not a contradiction, the promotion of a certain way of life with the destruction of other modes of life, the promotion of a certain kind of art to the destruction of all other free modes of expression. And I think there is something in that kind of, the dominance of a particular vision can often lead to the disappearance of so many other forms of ideas for society. So it's a constant and, an affirmative destruction, which is always, casting away certain bodies' lives as disposable to history. And I think that's where the art becomes a key indicator in the start of that eventual political process. So, yeah.
Just building on that previous question, presumably, I mean, you can actually do violence to history by trying to obliterate it. So, even in the smallest ways of non-platforming, these kind of things, you're actually potentially doing violence to not people, but actually past events, current events in the world.
Well, I don't know if you want to answer that first. Or...
Yes,
no, I'm a strong believer in the ideas of egregious people need to be taken on, not silenced. So, strangely, I'm giving a lecture tomorrow on Carl Schmitt. Right? And for if you don't know, Carl Schmitt is, to me, one of the most dangerous thinkers of the 20th century, one of the most formidable thinkers of the 20th century. But we need to engage with the ideas. To me, it's better to understand ideas we might find offendable, intolerable, and to try to understand them and to try to make sense of them. I want to know why people think the way they do. Right? And I think for me, that's far more important than actually saying, no, I'm right. Whatever you stand for is wrong. You have no place to speak in a university or in a setting like this. Or, to me, that's, again, one of, another indication of the tyranny of thinking. And I think we have to be, I know the dangers sometimes of, egregious thought, but I think the alternative, there's enough examples from history that show us why sensitive is by far the worst road to go down, whether it's art, thought, ideas, and so on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, online, nobody's unmuting themselves or showing their video, so we'll move back to the room one more time. Is there any other questions in the room? The gentleman at the front is going to get his second bite at the cherry. How fortunate. And Sally, is anybody asking any questions in the chat room at all? No. Okay.
It was really, it's rad. It's really just picking up the 1984. I mean, this greatest violence of all. I absolutely agree with you. The memory hole is the greatest form of violence, where the truth is rewritten and the old truth is destroyed. And the woke society that is emerging today reminds me very much of that part of the book. It's a terrible violence that you can throw away the truth on a continuous basis, and you institutionalize that with the memory hole.
Mhm.
And I just agree with what you said. I know it was a bit of a rant that you had, but it was very fundamental to our survival as a society and a thinking society.
Mhm. For somebody who's, I try to hide my political stripes from my students, because I keep saying to them, I'm not there to indoctrinate them, right? I'm here to facilitate the education. But, I grew up in the Welsh mining valleys. I couldn't be anything but a leftist, right? So, I belong to the left historically, and I also get a great deal of thought from, the ideas of Michel Foucault, the 1960s post-structuralist thinkers. And I recognize the importance of the movements that have happened over the past 10 years through the needs to decolonize society, have a better appreciation of the history of colonization, to recognize the multiple ways in which violence occurs, whether it's gendered, racial, class, and so on. I think those conversations have been really important for society. However, I do also recognize that we might be going too far in some of our directions. And I do think that there's a small element of the left, and I don't think it's consistent with all the left. There's a small element of the left which is becoming increasingly tolerant of critique, increasingly intolerant of other people's ideas. And I think that, to me, is a very dangerous road, because actually it's not slipping into authoritarianism so much, it's slipping into religion. It's becoming so morally assured of your position, it's almost puritanical. And I think I really struggle with some of it. I really struggle with, so I think, of course, the idea is that we need to be more socially attuned to social problems, absolutely. But I also think we need to recognize that sometimes there are people who see the world differently to us, and that's okay as well. So.
Yeah. It reminds me of the old adage, everyone is the other, no one is themselves. But I find it interesting that you make a connection between 1984 and, let's say, 2024 and the woke culture. That's an interesting thing to ponder. Right. Any more in the room? The lady in the middle.
Hi, thank you. That was great. And I do love it when art is combined with theory and it's all given sort of equal weighting. I'm trying to sort of think, because it's talking on an ideological level, but on the sort of basic human level, how are people helping to disappear other people? And like, for me, like, I suppose I'm thinking Hannah Arendt, evil is banal. Like, are people being threatened? Is that why they're going to help someone else be disappeared? What is it in our human nature that we're taking part in? And it's not even that banal. Like, if you're getting rid of a body, like, that's not passing paperwork across a room that's leading to mass like extinctions. I know it's a massive question, but I just wonder how much you contemplate that human element of people are doing this to each other.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's precisely one of, I suppose, many people have asked the same question, and we still wonder what's that. And I think following the conversations that we're having here as well is, I know you don't want, and there is this moment where when you start learning about disappearance, of course, you, for example, in Mexico, you'll hear about the cases, so you'll see them in the last I was saying is so visible that you just see it in the street and so on, as we were saying, how they are displayed and so on and so forth, that they are on the news, and then you hear stories of victims, you hear stories of the families, and you read the newspapers and the journalists writing the story and how it's happening. When you pass loads of information about how this is happening, you pass over, you read and you heard and you know about this, of course that you're seeking for the perpetrators, you're seeking for what evil must be doing all this, right? What's the evil behind all of this? And you imagine a monster, and you imagine a devil, and you imagine all those things. And then you realize, listening as well at there's so many, actually, well, not so many, but there are people who have spoke about how do they do it? How do they dispose of the body? How do they remove a body? You know, and so it is also very hard. And this is what also, you know, it's been said many times. It's hard to see that even a child can do it. It's even hard to see that a normal being that is just your neighbor can do it, and how they end up doing it. I think it's also very touching and very, I don't know, it's difficult to describe that when you listen to the side of things and how they're doing it, you realize, yes, some of them are complete dysfunctional, and they completely say, yeah, I do this, I do that. But most people you realize is just a matter of, well, I took the body, I had the body, so I did this, and then after this, there is someone else doing another job. I don't want to be too, sorry, I don't want to be too explicit about the things they do, because it's quite graphic and quite horrible, but you learn how they go through all of those things. And then, you know, precisely what they were saying, we need to know, we need to open up the doors. And I know we don't want to listen to the other side, but there are humans who are also, you know, we are cohabitating, you know, we live in a society, and there are humans doing good things, there are humans doing bad things, there are humans doing bad things because they can't, well, they've been situated in that position. So I think we need to listen to everybody, because it's a way of, even the people who are doing this, because it's a way of understanding and maybe trying to find ways of untangle everything and say, okay, from where do we start? What's going wrong? Where can I put a bit of a piece that can actually start fixing something? Because there are many pieces when you see the problem. There are many pieces that are wrong. So you have to start somewhere, and so you have to listen to everybody, because, you know, because that's the way it is. So, yeah.
I think, you know, the point around, first of all, I'm teaching the lecture on Amarant next week, and I think particularly her work on the concentration camp, first of all, is really important. And the point that she makes of what defines the concentration camp is the ghastly experiment to remove spontaneity itself as part of the human condition. Spontaneity is the human capacity to create, right? And that's what for her defined the concentration camp. And the point you talk about the banality of evil, you know, I also think, and Chantal was talking about the division of labor that goes into the political economy of human disappearance. And particularly, like, for instance, Zygmunt Bauman's important work on modernity and the Holocaust, when he said that what makes a Holocaust possible is precisely the fact that most people are not involved in the final act of killing. You just create an entire organization, almost like a Fordist production system, involved in the production of disposable humans, ultimately, right? And you see that again in the context of, so it's easy to fixate, as you say, on these one or two kids who are involved and get picked up from the streets, and these are the one or two local evil masterminds who are kind of, when you look at the political organization of disappearance right throughout the Latin Americas, you know, but especially in the context of Mexico, you can't divorce it from the professional organization of that killing, which begins in the United States of America, which the US government has a great deal of complicity in the organization of this, in terms of the systematic production of, you know, psychological warfare techniques, the professional training of professional killers who know how to recruit street kids because they have no other option but to be part of this system. And I think that takes a much deeper, and as Chantal was then saying, you know, that, you know, there's, you know, I think of, like, the final book which Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari wrote, called What is Philosophy? And they do this beautiful mediation on the testimonies of Primo Levi. And they say what Deleuze really taught us was the shame of being human, right? And how we all shamefully compromise with power. And in what ways are we all kind of complicit in this economy of violence, even though we perhaps don't even realize we have a part of it, you know, because we're all so connected in the world today. it's hard for us to disentangle the lines of our own influences in these organizations of violence. And I think that is also very difficult in today's globalized age, because things are so connected. We have no idea. I have no idea whether I'm buying an iPhone, whether it's leading to disappearances of people in China, right? So, you know, but we are part of that productive economy. And I think that's what we really need to start untangling today, is those, make things much more transparent. It seems to me transparency is perhaps the only alternative. Yeah.
Reminds me of the adage, just to close, you know, evil triumphs when good people do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the best way of describing it. And we can spend a lot of time on the banality of evil, but I think the idea that a group of humans are dehumanized to the extent that they're not regarded as human in a sort of institutional regime where you're trying to fit in, like Eichmann. You know, when you saw the trial in Jerusalem, the Eichmann trial, which is where banality of evil comes from, you know, he was a very unassuming bureaucrat. And he wasn't an evil personified. He was just somebody who thought he was doing what he was told to do, processing papers that actually ultimately sent people to their death. But all he thought was he was part of the mechanism of doing his job. And he was completely devoid of any humanity, realizing he left his humanity behind. It was a job to do something. He left his humanity behind. And I think we do a lot of that on an everyday basis. And I think all of us leave our humanity behind. You know, just look at the news every day of everything that's going on in the world, people being killed, etc., while we're eating our breakfast. We dehumanize things as well. We rationalize things, and you know, we look at information on a daily basis. You know, but in art, I think art has got the capacity to really show us what we're capable of as human beings. You know, how deep we can sort of fall into the abyss and hopefully emerge from it. Anyway, that's enough. I think that's enough. We need to be more positive. So, I mean, we come to the end, but I think please put your hands together again for Brad and Chantal.